anti-industrial policies put in place by hypothetically well-meaning, deluded, pseudo-religious environmental worshippers of the apocalypse.
In this video, I'm going to break down an extremely important clip of Jordan Peterson putting another arrow through the heart of the climate cult. And there is so much subtext here that it's hard to even believe that he fit it all in to this short interview. So strap yourselves in and let's get into the clips.
Environmentalism is supposed to be about protecting the environment, and most people are completely in favor of that. But the environmental movement of today has nothing to do with protecting the environment. They're destroying the environment, killing the California condor with their wind projects, and whales, and basically wrecking Africa with all the elements needed for their new battery revolution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not about the environment. It's some kind of weird cult around climate. And who better to assess a cult than Jordan Peterson, who is a famous psychologist and author. We asked him about what is happening recently. Here's the conversation that resulted. Jordan Peterson, thank you so much for coming on. Just to begin with the premise that the modern environmental movement doesn't seem to be doing a lot for the actual environment. It's my observation. What do you think that's about?
Well, I think the best example of that's probably both Sri Lanka and Germany. I mean, Sri Lanka is an absolute wasteland at the moment as a direct consequence of idiot, hypothetically environmentalist policies. And then in Germany, energy is much more expensive than it was. It's much more unreliable than it was. The Germans are dangerously dependent on dictators and the Russians. And that's all a consequence of hypothetical environmentalist policies. So even by the standards laid down by the environmentalists themselves, the policies that were put in place that were pro-environmental are failing.
So Peterson mentioned Germany there, and Germany's energy prices have been soaring since the war started in Ukraine. But the reason that energy prices are soaring is because of disastrous, woke energy policies, many of which put in place by Angela Merkel, who is also a young leader of the World Economic Forum, but that's for a different video. Germany came to an agreement to start shutting down all of the country's 84 coal plants by the year 2038 in an attempt to move towards strictly renewable energy. In 2021, Germany also closes half its remaining nuclear power plants. The shutdowns of the 3 plants take place as Europe faces one of its worst ever energy crises, and as support for nuclear as a low carbon energy is once again on the rise. Now, the plan to move towards renewables down the line is obviously one that at the moment is completely unrealistic. The fact of the matter is that you simply can't power the German economy with wind and solar, because what happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? Well, Germans actually have a word for that, and it's called Dunkelflaute. Dunkel meaning dark and Flaute meaning lull. One of the members of our team is German, by the way, so Seb can't wait for you to see that. He's going to abuse me. So, Dunkelflaute basically means that it is a cloudy and windless day. Well, can't we just store the energy when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing? Not really, because it's so expensive to store it. Plus, the batteries that they use to store it are terrible for the environment. So these disastrous policies also led to Germany being completely dependent on Russian energy. About 50% of their oil and natural gas came from Russia, which, by the way, Trump warned them about.
Germany will become totally dependent on Russian energy if it does not immediately change course. Here in the Western Hemisphere, we are committed to maintaining our independence from the encroachment of expansionist foreign powers. It has been the formal policy of our country since President Monroe.
I bet they're not laughing now. And Peterson did mention Sri Lanka there as well, and we will get to Sri Lanka at the end of this video, so make sure you stick around for that.
But there's something that's even deeper lying underneath the surface. Alex Epstein has made a fair bit of this in his new book, Fossil Future, but I started delving into this, I guess, 30 years ago when I wrote my first book, Maps of Meaning. So, Tucker, it's become pretty clear recently, as a consequence of converging evidence from a lot of different disciplines, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and literary criticism, odd bedfellows, by the way, and there's more scientific and humanities endeavors involved in this convergence than those, that the structure through which we see the world is essentially a narrative, is a story. Yes. And so and in fact, I asked the world's greatest neuroscientist about a month ago on my podcast, Carl Friston, if even our object perceptions were micro stories. And he said that that was clearly the case. And he's speaking as a scientist, by the way. And so that begs a question. If we see the world through a story, what is that story and what should it be? And what are the fundamental elements that the story has to contain?
Now, this part about the narrative structure is very, very interesting to hear, because of those of you who are students of Peterson's work will know that he's a student of Carl Jung's work. So it's very interesting to see the convergence of his Jungian school of thought with this climate narrative. So similar to what Jordan Peterson said, the narrative right now that is peddled is that human beings are a rapacious cancer on the planet and that we need to decrease the population. We are being brainwashed by the media, by our education systems, and by pop culture to believe this dark fallacy. And it's brainwashing that actually requires a lot of untangling. So with that, what should the narrative be? Well, in my opinion, we should be ethical stewards of the land and of the sea, with an emphasis on human flourishing and mitigating global suffering. I also believe that we have a responsibility to use human genius and ingenuity to move towards the most responsible and cleanest sources of energy, but not whilst starving millions or potentially even billions of people.
And so the environmentalists offer us a story to live by, and it's a pseudo-religious story, and it essentially elevates the biosphere, the earth, Gaia, the earth goddess, let's say, to the status of primary deity, and characterizes her as sort of a waif-like, innocent victim, easily taken advantage of and fragile. It casts the entire human endeavor on the social front as a raping and pillaging patriarch.
Stick around, guys, because there's so much important information here. But obviously, if you like this content, like and subscribe. And also, with this particular video, leave me a comment and let me know what interested you about this video, if anything at all. Because the way that my channel works is I like to make these videos to chip away at a much larger problem. But if there's anything that you've heard in this video or other videos that you'd like me to go deeper on and expand upon, then let me know, because that helps me to really curate my content to exactly what you guys are interested in.
Monster only interested in power, and it casts the individual as like a devouring mouth riding on the back of that giant, essentially. And so that's a description of the world. And there's some truth to that, right? Because we can wreak environmental havoc.
Yes.
Social structures can become power mad, and we can be carelessly consumerist. But it's a very incomplete story. It demonizes in a very pathological manner. So when you hear people say things like, human beings are nothing but a cancer on the face of the planet, or there's too many people on the planet for the earth to feed, let's say, then you're seeing reflections of that underlying pseudo-religious narrative, and it's extraordinarily dangerous.
I love that Jordan Peterson talks about the religious narrative structure of the climate cult, and this is something that is manifestly true. This is a movement with unquestionable religious structure and even religious dogma. Throughout history, human beings have always had an innate desire to deify and worship, and the climate narrative creates a simple and all-encompassing lens from which to view the world, a lens that offers an alternative to the dread and horror of existential uncertainty, a framework that provides some structure in a world where we're sitting on a rock, hurtling through space, and we're all slowly marching towards being grey and old, and eventually the grave, eventually the ultimate abyss. And some of the ways which the religious narrative is truly evident includes the fact that they've got their own climate evangelists seeking to convert the non-believers. There are also heretics, the equivalent to Martin Luther with his 95 Thesis, people like Bjorn Lomborg and Alex Epstein, non-believers who go against the narrative that are sacrificed to the sun god. Well, not yet, anyway. They worship the god of Mother Nature, Gaia. They have their own priests and prophets in Bill Gates and Bill Nye and David Attenborough. And just like every religion throughout history, they also have their own apocalyptic prophecies. But the most damning evidence for me about the religious structure is the fact that the climate change narrative perfectly coincides with the death of God in the West. As our culture becomes less religious, it becomes more environmentalist.
Now, the reason that you can see that in some ways it's a religious structure rather than a careful attempt to grapple with the full realities of the world is that it has these odd features. So, for example, the environmentalists tend to radically oppose nuclear power and also natural gas. And it's clearly the case that there's nothing that reduces carbon production more effectively than nuclear power. That's, I don't think anybody with any sense ever debates that. And it's also clearly the case that if we were careful with nuclear power, and we could be because we've been building nuclear plants for a long time, that we could be providing extremely low-cost energy to people, especially poor people throughout the world. But we are not going to do that. In fact, we have an anti-energy policy in place, especially in any places that are ruled essentially by the left. And the consequence of that is, well, I just saw today, UNICEF just released a report showing that there's been a 25% increase in the last year and a half in the number of women and children that are starving around the world. It's a direct consequence of the increase in energy prices, which are in themselves a direct consequence of anti-industrial policies put in place by hypothetically well-meaning, deluded, pseudo-religious environmental worshippers of the apocalypse. It's an appalling situation, and it's likely to get worse, I would say, before it gets better.
So Jordan Peterson mentions a recent study by UNICEF. So let's go through that in a little bit more detail. Malnutrition in mothers soars by 25% in crisis-hit countries, putting women and newborn babies at risk. With half of stunting in children under 2 developing during pregnancy and before 6 months, new report raises the alarm on the need to invest in essential nutrition programs for adolescent girls and women. New York, 7th of March 2023. The number of pregnant and breastfeeding adolescent girls and women suffering from acute malnutrition has soared from 5.5 million to 6.9 million, or 25% since 2020, in 12 countries hardest hit by the global food and nutrition crisis, according to the new report released by UNICEF today. The 12 countries, including Afghanistan, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen, represent the epicenter of a global nutrition crisis that has been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine and ongoing drought, conflict, and instability in some countries. So just in summary there, 25% increase in malnutrition is a massive jump. And it's not just that they're hungry now, it affects generations to come because of the stunting, like they said. And nobody really mentions this, but it's massively to do with what happened during the pandemic and with unbelievably stupid energy policies. If you guys think that we had it bad because people were hoarding toilet paper and you couldn't get your favorite oriental spices for a few weeks,
let go, stop it!
And your petrol prices went up, spare a thought for those in sub-Saharan Africa who were literally clinging on to life and were pushed off the edge by these policies and by these supply chain disruptions. These people depend on cheap energy for survival. And cheap energy is the key ingredient to raising these countries and the most destitute people in our world out of poverty, which we had been making so much progress in doing over the past few decades. And here is a very analogous video representation of just that. So what are these policies, you might be asking? Well, we heard about what happened in Germany, but another one that we have to really worry about is called ESG. What ESG stands for is environmental, social, and governance. And basically, what it is it's a woke, centralized scoring system whereby big companies and corporations are told that they have to have a certain social and environmental impact. This comes with heavy regulation, and it fundamentally changes the way that our free markets work. Why do you think we have big corporations simping for woke agendas like BLM and the LGBTQ movement? Why do you think you see all of these pride flags on logos? Why do you think we have airlines now telling us what our carbon footprint is when we go to buy a plane ticket? Because they're all just self-flagellating and simping for the globalist, woke, World Economic Forum ESG agenda. And who gets to create this agenda, you might ask? Well, I'll give you a hint. They love to gather on private jets in Davos. And so what's a good example of how ESG has impacted a country? Well, Jordan Peterson mentioned Sri Lanka before. According to the Daily Caller, Sri Lanka has run out of fuel and is facing the worst economic crisis in decades. A chemical fertilizer ban in 2021, part of an initiative to cut nitrogen waste and implement greener farming practices, drastically reduced crop yields and damaged Sri Lanka's trade balance. The decision to overnight shift away from synthetic fertilizers was an absolute disaster, economist Peter Earle told Daily Caller News Foundation. And Sri Lanka isn't the only country that has been affected by these centralized environmentalist policies. We saw massive protests in Holland last year and in other places throughout Europe, whereby the governments are implementing the same things and getting rid of key fertilizers as just one example. And this is only the beginning, and I truly believe this is going to get worse and worse and worse, especially when you see Bill Gates buying up farmland. He's now the largest private landholder in the United States. And the WEF saying we're going to eat bugs and all this bug-eating propaganda happening around the world now. And then you look at the really dark stuff, the depopulationist narrative, the Malthusian ideology. And I've done a video explaining that in quite a bit of detail. So I'll leave that video as the recommended one at the end of this. So with all that in mind, I'm wondering if you're connecting the same dots as I am. Henry Kissinger, who is somebody that Klaus Schwab is greatly influenced by, said the following: "Who controls the food controls the people. Who controls the energy can control whole continents, and who controls money can control the world." Now, do with that what you will, and it's a very complicated and sometimes helpless feeling situation. But I'm grateful for Jordan Peterson, and I'm hoping that this consortium that he's building will be the antidote to this chaos. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to hit the link tree in the top of the comments if you'd like to reach out to me on social media, or if you'd like to join the Rattlesnake TV community, where I do an unfiltered, uncensored show on locals every single week. All the stuff I can't say on YouTube. I mean, I'm already pushing it as it is, clearly. And if you'd like to watch another video, the one that I recommended before, then click here. And if you'd like to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, then click here. Until next time, I'm Jake. This is Rattlesnake TV, keeping you armed and dangerous.